I think the Lord will tailor his message to his children who are in the middle of a big bickering fight.
Yeah.
Which I think is happening between the two sides more than ever before in the history of the church.
We are Saints in the South, your source for gospel growth and good times. All right, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Saints in the South. We have a familiar face on with us again, Jacob Hansen from Thoughtful Faith. Good to have you back.
Good to be back. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, yeah. So, like I say, you've been with us before. Your channel's been growing well. You continuing to put out a lot of content. Your Facebook page is growing. So, great job out there.
Yeah, it's been pretty wild. It's been growing more and faster than I expected. That's for sure.
So, are you liking that? Are you able to keep up with it?
It's funny, yes and no. I feel a lot more pressure to actually put out content, and so because there's more people that like are asking for it, and then I interact with a lot more people now, and it's taken up a lot more of my time than it used to, and it just feels higher pressure. But it also has been good to talk to more people and to feel like I've gotten a lot of really good feedback from people overall. And so it's been cool to make a lot of new friends like you guys.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't see how you do it, honestly, because you're putting out so much content now. I don't have time to even watch or listen to all of it. I couldn't imagine putting out that much content.
Well, I'm trying to, it's funny. I've had some weeks I'll get a lot of stuff that I'll be able to put together. I try and be really efficient about it. And I kind of have a system, but I've even realized I think I've been overdoing it too much, and I need to like slow it down and focus a little more on quality rather than just quantity. The problem is, what it is, there's things that come up, and then I'm like, oh, like I want to make a video about that,
right?
Or some, and so the problem is I have all these things that happen or I'm thinking about, and then I want to talk about them, and then if I don't do it, then I feel like it just sits in my mind and like bugs me.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what motivates me to do it.
And I feel like there's a lot of people kind of living through you a little bit too. There's a lot of people, like myself included, that see things going on in the world and really, have thoughts about it. And like, gosh, man, I wish I could like express, what it is about this thing that's bothering me so much. And then, somebody like you comes along and expresses it perfectly. And so, and there's a lot of people that are like, yeah, that's it. That's exactly like the way you said it right there. That's exactly it. So I think a lot of people kind of are having a little bit of a, living through you vicariously in a way, as far as,
well, I'd caution
those concerns.
I'd caution them to not take me too seriously. but I would say that as I've been doing this, it is funny how, and it's funny when I even started putting out any content at all, like when I first started writing on my blog and stuff, it was like, I didn't feel good until I had let it all out, until I had expressed my feelings about it. I felt like it was just bottled up inside of me. Yeah. And like, I had to it's like the world created this, I don't know, cognitive dissonance or some kind of just like something that was bugging me. And when I make the video, it's kind of like, okay, or I make a blog or whatever, it was like, okay, I can set that aside now. I've taken care of that one. It's resolved in my mind.
I do have one additional question before we jump into some of the topics that we have. How's the family time? And being able to kind of balance that with as your channel has grown. What's some adaptations there?
I think the main thing. Actually, it hasn't been affected too much. What's been affected is my sleep.
Okay.
Because I do a lot of my work kind of after the kids go down.
Good. Yeah.
And then, so that way I'm not interfering with family time, but I kind of feel like I'm back in college again, where I'm going to bed at like 1 a.m, 2 a.m.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, good for you. Good for you on being able to sacrifice the sleep rather than sacrificing the family time. Good job.
I'm trying to get a balance here, because even the sleep side of it, you need that too.
You do. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I used to say I'll get enough sleep when I'm dead. It's all right. Of course, I used to say that, but now I'm like, no, I can't go without my sleep.
Yeah, it affects me a lot more than it get used to.
Well, Kenny, we'll let you get us started.
All
here.
right. So for those of you listening who did not hear the previous episode we had Jacob on, number one, go back and listen to it. You're missing out. It's good stuff. But also, I wanted to invite Jacob back on because there's lots of things that I wanted to discuss that we never even got a chance to discuss because it was more of kind of an introductory thing. So I was losing my voice, and so it was embarrassing for me. So this is kind of, I feel like a chance for me to redeem myself here and be able to actually communicate a little bit more efficiently without the raspy voice. But there's a lot of things going on that, and this episode I feel like is primarily for our audience, in our region in the Southeast United States. The culture is very, very different here than pretty much anywhere else. And I've talked about this before on Saints in the South, how there's good and there's bad. There's pros and cons to everything. And there are downsides to the Bible, being a Latter-day Saint in the Bible Belt, but there are some really good pros. And some of the pros are that there is a very, very strong sense of right and wrong and morality and, the adherence to basic Christian concepts around here. And so there's a lot of stuff that I guess for us, what we look at as just normal, everyday, average people, to people in other parts of the country might see as like hardcore right-wing religious, something, but that's the norm here, so it's a little bit different of a paradigm shift. And there are things that we see on the internet that I'm kind of curious about, that I know Jacob is a little bit more, outside of our region and involved in things, a little bit more familiar with. So I wanted to hit on a few points that our audience in the South might not be familiar with. And something, the first point I wanted to ask you about, Jacob, is we touched on this a little bit in our conversation with Greg Mattson, but we've been seeing a lot of policy changes in the church recently. We've been seeing a lot of changes in, the handbook and adjustments, quote unquote, here and there. And there are those who are really like seeing the adjustments that have been made, and others that are a little bit more hesitant about it, because part of it seems to be that there is the more liberal, the more progressive aspect of the church membership that seem to be influencing this. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Do you think, number one, that those members that are more liberal, progressive, however you want to say it, do you think that they are influencing church policy at this point, or is it a coincidence that things sometimes seem to be moving in the direction? Because I know those on that side would give the opposite argument. They'd say that, oh my gosh, the church is being so conservative, fascist, or whatever. So it's a little bit interesting for me. It makes me wonder how much is the membership actually influencing church policy, or is the church policy indeed guided by revelation? And if it happens to align with somebody's political or social beliefs, is that just coincidence?
So I've been thinking a lot about that too. And the first thing I would say is that there's no doubt that there is I don't like to think in terms of left and right. I like to think in terms of true and false, right? Yeah. I don't really care if it's on the left. If it's true and it's right, then it's good. And if it's, it's right and wrong and true or false, that's what I care about. As far as the church's policies, I think that a lot of our, what I call mid-level institutions in the church, kind of not the formal institutions of the church per se, but things like BYU or things like Deseret Book, right? There's no doubt that those institutions are being hit pretty hard by generally ideologies that are currently in the academic institutions. So this is where all of this is coming from, by the way. All of these weird things that we're seeing, this critical social justice type stuff the feminism, the critical race theory, these ideologies. And I want to frame this. These aren't quote unquote political movements. They're ideological movements about the nature of mankind and about the nature of morality. and about the structuring of society. And these are things that are fully things the church is invested in.
Yes.
And so what's happened is that our academic establishment in the United States has really adopted the critical theory of the Frankfurt School and sort of this hard leftism. And the thing is that BYU and anyone in the church who goes on to get a college education is going to be confronted with that particular type of ideology. And a lot of them are grabbing onto it. And then what happens is then this ideology is different though than others. Other ideologies like, oh, okay, leave the church and you leave the institutions that you don't like. This ideology is no, you need to go into those institutions and change them.
Yes.
Okay. So does that affect the church's quote unquote policy? I think it definitely does on certain levels and on certain things, like the types of books that you see in Deseret Book. It's not like the prophet is sitting there praying to the Lord and getting revelation directly from God on every single book that's put on the shelf at Deseret Book. Okay. Like, let's not be ridiculous here. Nor is he, in the hiring and firing of every professor that's out there. Definitely not. But so there is some influence from that, but I also think some of it, maybe we got to be careful. I think that the church, that the leaders of the church under inspiration, and even I believe God would inspire them to do this, will try and reach out to those who are maybe on that side, because I'm sorry if I'm rambling, but it's kind of a complicated topic.
Kind of building bridges.
Yeah. Well, here's the way I see it. Imagine you have two kids that are fighting. You love both your children. And you know that one of them is about 90% right and the other one's about 90% wrong. But you want them both to stay in the house, and you want them both you don't want that one who's 90% wrong to leave. And so the problem is that if you reach out to that one who's 90% wrong about the 10% that they're right about, the person on the other side might feel like, what are you doing? Like, you're siding with the bad guys, even though maybe you're just like, I'll use this as an example. Racism in the church. Okay. Our church has never been, if you want to talk about maybe the least racist people, Latter-day Saints are about the least racist people I've ever met. Okay. And in this period of our history, specifically, we're the least racist people in our history. Yet now is when we have a conference talk about racism. It's like, where was that talk back in the 60s or 50s or whatever? You know what I mean? But as I thought more about it, I came to realize everything in that talk on racism, by the way, was spot on. I agree with every word of it. It was just, why are we having that talk now? And what I came to realize was, I can see that maybe the brethren and even the Lord will go out and teach the principles, because there is a significant part of our church that are concerned about racism. And that if you give that message, it will resonate with those people and help them to realize that the church is, and you just teach the truth about racism, and it will resonate with those people. Now, granted, some of them take that and spin it into all sorts of crazy ideas of the way that they interpret the talk. But when you actually go and read the talk, it was a good talk. So is there an influence within the church? Yes. I think for the most part, though, I don't think it's driving church policy, but I do think that the Lord will reach out to those who are, the Lord will give us what we can handle. And I think the Lord will tailor his message to his children who are in the middle of a big bickering fight. Which I think is happening between the two sides more than ever before in the history of the church.
Well, I see a lot of influence, a lot of things going on out west that are really shocking, actually, to me. The things that would be absolutely unthinkable in our part of the country. There's the drag shows and all the things going on. There's these, the big pride parades with all like the over sexualization and things going on that seems strange to see here, because that kind of stuff is just would never happen here. Never, ever. Not it. I mean, it's literally unthinkable. Like no one would even imagine that kind of stuff happening. So
it's taboo, right?
yes,
It's taboo in
it's
your
definitely,
culture.
it's outside of the Overton window, or however you want to think of it. And to me, and tell me what your thoughts on this, because I feel like there's almost, to borrow from Peterson, the animating spirit in a way, like, because the stuff you were talking about, you mentioned the Frankfurt School, and, I am a social worker. And so obviously I'm, familiar with, Michel Foucault and, Jacques Derrida and things like that. And a lot of the thought today is heavily influenced by these thinkers who weren't all wrong, but there are a lot of things that I would strongly disagree with, that, that some of these people, some of their ideas and the ideas they put forth. And I think there's a lot of people, like the way these ideas kind of seep into the culture. And once again, like Peterson says, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And these ideas kind of take hold, and it becomes kind of an animating spirit of the culture. Whereas here in the Southeast United States, in the, quote unquote Bible Belt, I think people would say that they're more influenced by the animating spirit is that of Christ, is what they would say. And indirectly, I would think so, because there's other people like famous preachers like Jonathan Edwards, who gave the Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God sermon and all these things, that have had a strong influence on the culture in this part of the country. So it kind of is just a different animating spirit at work that has created a whole different, like our little Overton window of what's acceptable here is completely different than what might be going on out west.
And it would depend on the region. Even within Utah, you know what I mean? If you're in one particular part of Utah, it's going to be a lot more like it is over there in the South. You go to somewhere like, I don't know, I feel like I've been seeing a ton coming out of Sandy, Utah. I don't know what's in the water there, but they well, actually I do to some extent know. Sorry if there's some background noise here. But it depends on how much influence those people have had within the university system and the political currents that are there. The church always exists within a political context, and that political context influences the members in the way that they see the gospel. And that can be, and that's from both sides, from both left and right. And I think that the more members begin to shed those sort of political ideologies and just look at what is the gospel and focus on that, I think the more you can cure these things. But you're right. We also in the church have Latter-day Saints tend to be very, very tolerant, very, very nice people. And that is unfortunately what these people prey on.
Yeah. And that's another thing that is, like I said, the pros and cons of living in this part of the country. I know people, we all have friends down here that are of other faiths, other Christian denominations that are great people, but they're definitely not as nice, quote unquote, in that way that we are. They're very much outspoken, very much, like they know what they believe is right. And they're, by golly, they'll get out and pitch a fit for it. They don't, and it's almost like they don't care if they offend you, because they're like, I don't care. They're waving their Bible around. So I said, for better or worse, whatever it is, there's less tolerance, which is a double-edged sword, which can be good and sometimes and can be harmful.
Yes, taboo is I like to use the word taboo, right? Yeah. And every culture has its taboos, and every culture should have its taboos, right? There are things that cross the line to where they're not acceptable. And it's funny because everyone's tolerant until it's a racist, right? And then it's like, no tolerance for racists, right?
That's right.
So everybody, and that's fine. Like, fair enough. Like, don't tolerate racism. You shouldn't. But then it's like, that becomes the only sin that exists is racism and bigotry. And that's like it. And it's like, no, you guys, like, we should be intolerant of all sin that is clearly sin, but we should also be tolerant of sinners, right? Yes. There's a difference between the sin and the sinner. And so I think in the South, sometimes they can go a little too far the other direction and be rather intolerant towards people. But I don't think we should be tolerant of ideas that are clearly false and wrong.
Yes. And that's the thing where there's a fine line there, because on one hand, nobody wants to, in our, parlance of our day, nobody wants to be labeled as intolerant. Intolerance is just, if you're intolerant, that's, I don't know, like McCarthyism today, that you're just, oh my gosh, if you're intolerant, you're a horrible person. However, and we talk about discrimination, and discrimination has a very negative connotation. However, discrimination is not a bad thing in and of itself. Discrimination, if you take 1,000 different examples of discrimination, 999 of them are going to be good, but the one that's bad is the one we usually think of when we think of discrimination, as far as excluding people on the basis of their race or their sexuality or, gender or whatever it is. And that's obviously bad. And we agree on that. But, when it comes to discrimination is just making decisions based on value decisions. What's good, what's bad. It's like when I go get a glass of milk and I take a gulp of it and it's lumpy and it smells horrible and I spit it out, I'm discriminating. Like, I don't hate the milk, but I'm like, I shouldn't be drinking this milk because it's sour and it'll make me sick. So I think it is interesting that sometimes it can be good to be discriminate against ideas, especially when those ideas are dangerous. And that's where the whole, the free speech battle that's going on right now comes in, because it's strange to me that people seem to strongly disagree so much on things that used to be pretty much fundamental, like in the country. Most people were on the same page as far as basic values of what's right and wrong. And that seems to be eroding more and more.
Absolutely. It's, and within the church, because we're so nice and so tolerant, a lot of times we allow people to steamroll us, or these ideologies which play on your righteous sentiments towards compassion and towards those things, allow them to weaponize your empathy in order to basically get you to believe things that aren't true. And oftentimes these ideologies, it's like, I heard one time the best analogy. They said that the devil rarely tells you lies. He tells you truth and lies, and he mixes them together.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's what he did in the garden. Right.
Yes.
With Adam and Eve, is that he told them truth and lies, or half truths. You know what I mean?
And the thing, yes. And the way he presents it too is, and sorry to cut you off, but
no, you're fine.
You mentioned empathy. I think that's a really, really important point that I don't want to, because empathy can be weaponized. Empathy can be used, and that's something that in the presentation of the endowment, I'm trying not to get into too much here, but there were, okay, so when we go to the temple, there's the endowment, which, in which we're educated and we make covenants, and there is a depiction of creation, and there's a video. And so when I received my endowment, there was a video that had been the same video the church had been using worldwide for decades, as far as I know, long time. So then the church produced several different endowment videos, depicting creation. And there was one that really, and so the initial video seemed really dry. I remember thinking, this is really, it sounded like people like reading cards badly, like, it's like, Lucifer, what have you done? I was like, but then I was telling myself, okay, I'm not here to be entertained. I'm here to be educated and to, make covenants. This isn't supposed to be like, a Broadway musical or something. Yeah. But there was one of the productions that had acting where there was a lot of actual acting, and it really hit me hard in a way that I had never. It really changed me. I think that one instance of watching the endowment video, I think, changed me forever, because there's a depiction of Lucifer tempting Eve, and he's not, like, he's not all I'm the devil and ever. He literally, like, he kneels down with tears in his eyes, offering her the fruit and saying, there is no other way. And it gives me chills thinking about it now, because it hit me so hard that is how Satan works. He doesn't come to us and say, you're going to do bad things. You're going to be an evil person now. He comes to us humbly with tears in his eyes, saying, if you love people, if you care about people, this is the only way. You have to do this. And it really hit me hard, because I feel like that is a lot of the influence that Satan has in the world today, is that it's under the guise of empathy. It's under the guise of compassion. It's under the guise of, if you really care, then there is no other way. This is the way.
Yep. And that's how you can weaponize a person's empathy towards the wrong ends, right? It's when you have all mercy and no justice, you have a problem. And the same thing if you have all justice and no mercy, right? There's the idea of love and law and the need to, I don't say to balance them, I say to integrate them. And the reality is that you're not helping anyone if you're encouraging them in any way to distance themselves from the commandments of the Lord. And the reality is like with things like homosexual behavior, like it's clear, like we know what our position is. And almost on all of these issues, that's the number one issue that it comes down to. People simply do not believe that homosexual behavior is sinful. And when you do that, you then are impelled. All right, so you say this, there's nothing wrong with this, yet the church is coming down and condemning these people. Therefore, we need to change that. And then those people get together, like-minded people, and they begin to agitate against the church in subtle and sometimes less than subtle ways. And one of the things that I've tried to do on my channel is just to point this out, to just make it very clear, to just shine light on it and say, hey guys, this is what's going on in the church. And we all know that there's a significant divide in the church right now. There's no doubt about it. And I think that when it comes to church policy, and I don't know what my take on it is this. Back that analogy of two fighting children. The brethren are trying to keep the family together. Remember, the brethren's goal, the goal of them and their thing is to keep people, to have people make and keep covenants with Christ. And so their actions are going to do the things that are necessary to try and keep people in the boat without compromising our values. And when I go read the talks from the brethren and I go and look closely at what they're saying, it's all, again, I use that racism one as an example. That talk was great. It's right on the money. There's zero falsehood in that talk. But the idea is that they're trying to say things to hopefully keep everyone in the boat as much as possible and address people's concerns that they're having today. And we have to recognize that there's a significant amount of the church that are being heavily influenced by this ideology. And do I think that that's the right approach necessarily? I don't know. I think they're trying to figure it out too. Because I don't know that there's any one size fits all policy. It's real easy to say, yeah, let's just, lay down the hammer and tell them all to get with the program or get out. And it's like, that's real easy to say, off the cuff until you're dealing with a family that gets torn apart. Yeah. And now mom left the church and dad's trying to figure out how to keep the kids, and go to church and he's still a faithful believer. And now you have a family that's like falling apart because mom decided that she can't take the hard stances of the church. So there's very real consequences to this. And so I have very light, I may have opinions, but I'm very tentative in my opinions about the way the church is handling all this. It's not my stewardship. I'm not the one receiving the revelation for it. But then again, I will point out, especially when I see things in sort of mid-level management that I just think is absurd, like carrying Richard Ostler's book at Deseret Book. It's like that kind of stuff. To me, I'm just going to point that out and say, hey, everyone, just so we're all aware here, here's an activist in the church who's taking advantage of mid-level institutions to do this. So,
So for our listeners, who is Richard Ostler and what is this book about?
So Richard Ostler has a book called Listen, Learn, and Love. And what's funny, again, 90% of the book, great. It's talking about treating people that are, gay or bisexual or whatever, that they, treating them with respect and with dignity and being kind to them and all that kind of stuff. And lamenting some of the language and things that people have had in the past that haven't been right and haven't been good. So yay.
Yeah, I think most of us can get behind that completely, wholehearted.
Yeah, yes, I can get behind, like I said, probably 90% of his book, but I use this analogy. Glass isn't dangerous when it's out on the table. We all see it. We all know not to touch it. But when you put shards of glass in a cupcake, that's when it's really dangerous.
Yeah.
And that's what they do. And so within his book, and I don't think I'm not saying anything bad about him. But he takes this sort of compassion to the point that in his book, he's validating the idea that 3-year-olds can be trans, and that parents should be validating their 3-year-old as transgender. And it's like, what? Like, so we went from
very extreme.
Let's be nice to like, let's validate anything anyone says ever, no matter how absurd.
Yeah. So talking about how the churches, or how the brethren, how the prophet, the Quorum of the 12, how they are kind of responding to this big push, big movement. You know, and you'd mentioned about, maybe some people think that, they should be bringing down the hammer a little more, and maybe to put it in words, they're not being the prophet, I think, or President Nelson isn't being the prophet I think he should be. Right. I think he should come down stronger. And that's where we really have to be careful. And like you said, that's, I don't envy that position that he's in. I mean, he's got the weight of the world and I think you just described it perfectly, that trying to keep everybody in the boat, right. To bring us home. But I think this period of time, it really feels like a sifting, right. That's been prophesied about. Does that feel like it to y'all at all?
Yeah,
literally sifting of the church.
The wheat. There's the parable of the wheat and the tares. Remember, they grow up together. They're. It isn't until later that they're separated.
Right.
And I think to some extent, the brethren, what they're doing, at least as far as I can tell, and this is just my take on it, is that they're staying faithful to the doctrine while being as accommodating as possible, is what they're trying to do. And so, while they are trying to be as accommodating as possible, there are people, even like me at times, who have this feeling like this is only going to make the problem worse, or this is, and I don't necessarily say that they're always doing the right thing. Like, I'm Joseph Smith. I look back at the old the Kirtland Safety Society. It's like, maybe they're pulling a Kirtland Safety Society and this is a big mistake, but in their policies and the way that they're doing things, like, that's fine. I don't reject them as prophets, seers, and revelators. I have a significant amount of leeway, but the way I see it is that you're dealing with a divided church right now. And I think if I were going to sum up what I think they're trying to do, is that they're allowing the wheat and the tare to grow up together, and eventually the tares will separate, simply because the brethren will stay faithful to the doctrine. And I don't see them compromising doctrine. I've never seen that. I've just seen them reaching olive branches where they can. And to some extent, it's like, all right, like, that doesn't seem like a crazy thing to me. As long as you're faithful to the doctrine and our church, like, then I'll sustain you in what you're doing.
Excellent. And there are some that you mentioned take a harder stance, and that actually is a good segue into the next thing I wanted to ask you about. DesNat. What is DesNat? What is this thing that this, because all I know of DesNat is like there's a Facebook page that shares silly memes and says things, and they definitely seem to be more of like the more how'd you describe the more drop the hammer, this is how it is kind of thing.
To an extreme. So
what exactly is DesNat?
So let's just talk about the history of DesNat, okay? Because I've kind of watched it all happen. And so what happened was that there was a hashtag created for Deseret Nation, or Deseret Nationalist, shortened for DesNat.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this was all done as a reaction to the movement towards progressivism within the broader culture generally. We all know of like the Pepe memes and all of kind of like the alt-right, sort of the creation of that movement. Okay. And it was this, we're not going to take it anymore. We're going to go on the offensive against the people that are against us. Right. Like, we're going to pull out our swords and be like the zealots in Israel. We're going to go kill some Romans. Like, they're going to pull out and fight back against it. So if you think about in the broader culture, this sort of woke progressivism, and then the response to that being the creation of sort of this alt-right Pepe memes And the whole idea of this dynamic that existed in the late 2000s was to trigger people. It was, you go online, you have some snowflake person, and you post something, and then you watch them go crazy, right?
Okay.
And you just laugh with your friends and make fun of these people, how they just go nuts. And you know exactly what to say. You can imagine a bunch of 15 to 20-year-old guys just having the time of their life, watching people just flip out over the stuff that they post. And all of us know, because it is pretty funny when you watch some of these people lose their minds.
Oh, yeah.
Over this stuff, right? So DesNat was essentially a Mormon version of that movement. Okay. Mm-hmm. So what they did was they created this hashtag DesNat. And so whenever they would post memes to trigger progressive Latter-day Saints, they would, they would post with the meme, they'd post hashtag DesNat.
Yes.
Right. Like, and to be honest, people who kind of are put off by the crazy progressive types, we're kind of like, this is awesome. Like, these are hilarious.
Very entertaining. Yeah.
This is super funny. And so you ended up having people starting to kind of join in on the fun, and they would also post the hashtag DesNat. Well, it ended up kind of creating this group of people that were super emboldened, and they started to get kind of popular on Twitter. Not super big. I mean, you could honestly, there's a handful of accounts that, 50 accounts that were really active doing this, 50 people, like, come on, you guys. People made it out to be this huge thing. And what happened though is that some of these guys were like, well, out of this whole group of quote unquote DesNats, I would say the majority of them were just kind of like people who didn't like progressives and would post funny memes and kind of laugh about it. Yeah. But then there was a group of them that straight up had some weird ideas. And all of a sudden people started seeing some of the things they were posting, and it was like, wait, what? And even me, I was one of those ones who's kind of like laughing at the memes, and I was kind of like, oh, this is kind of funny. Like, kind of like this little DesNat thing. This is kind of funny. And then all of a sudden I started seeing some other stuff. And then I even have a post on my website about it, where I show people, because people will claim that I'm a DesNat if you critique a progressive, like, you're a DesNat, right? Yeah. And so I actually have posts where I denounced them and said, like, you guys are being absolutely absurd. Like, what are you doing posting this kind of stuff, using the N-word, being very racist, talking about like sending Kwaku back to Africa, and just oh
gosh, I haven't even seen that.
Oh yeah. Wow. Horrible stuff. And then some of the violent rhetoric, which some of it was kind of playful and funny, and some of it wasn't. This weird guy Haas that would like come on with a knife and like had a mask on. It was like, it just got weird. Right. And you just had these people that were like, all right, like, there's some funny memes coming out of this that I genuinely can laugh at, but there's some of you that are straight up weirdos, and that frankly are not only weirdos, but like, you're doing bad stuff online. And so, and then but the thing is that then the progressive side of the equation, they started to point at these people and say, look, they're all like this. And there was an Antifa group, no joke, like literally linked to Antifa, that created a website called Expose DesNat.
Yes.
And they went after getting all of the public information about these guys out. Several people lost their jobs, including someone who I know personally, who is a good dude that has never said any of the racist, crazy stuff, but he had used the hashtag before when he had posted some funny memes. And then they went after him. He lost his job.
Wow.
And then he lost another job after that because someone else came after him again. And this guy has like a wife and kids and stuff. I mean, it was crazy.
Yeah. Funny story. I actually, I no longer share anything on any of my social media about where I work, because I was called into my boss's office one day, and I was told that the senior management at the agency that I work for had received a notification that that I was a horrible person and I should not be employed. I'm not fit to be a social worker. I should not be working as a therapist because I was associated with DesNat. And it was kind of really creepy in a really weird dystopian kind of way with his hat, but at the same time, it was a little bit funny because my boss obviously had never heard that word in her life before. It was like Desnat, and I did kind of chuckle, like
another example being down here in the South.
Yeah, down the South. Nobody in the South has ever heard that term, like except for maybe a handful of us in the church that are really active on social media or something, you know. But yeah, so it was. I mean, obviously, I fortunately I didn't lose my job, but I was advised to take anything that mentions where I work off of my social, to not to anything that I'm doing online to not be directly associated with the agency that I currently work for. And I said, that's fair enough. That's very fair. I can do that.
Yeah.
But it really is kind of scary to know that these people do have the power to ruin lives. And just
the progressive types what they'll do is they'll lump anyone who's ever used a Desnat hashtag and or anyone who is just pushing back against progressivism, and then they will rope you into that group and say you're part of them, right?
Yeah.
Or you're a Desnat adjacent, is what Jim Bennett was recently saying about even Midnight Mormons, right? And so it's like,
that's hilarious.
Well, the thing is that it's awful. Actually, it's you're trying to lump people in to a group. If you push back, you're a Desnat. And so
because those people that think that way are all about identity. It's all about your identity. It's all about what group identity you are. And
well, I mean, think about it. Think about how many people have to keep their mouth shut.
Yeah.
You can't, like, our side doesn't go after your job and try and ruin your life.
No.
They will. And even amongst Latter-day Saints, they will. I'm lucky because I'm in an employment situation where I don't have to worry about that. And that's one of the reasons I do what I do, because I know there are so many people, even family members of mine, who would be way more outspoken, but they will lose their jobs. And I had a friend of mine who just lost his job working for an ambulance company because it was not associated with work in any way. He just went online and was talking with some people. And in a comment section, he said that he believes that a man can't be a woman and that this is gender dysphoria. And, that it's a form of mental illness. And that was his opinion, and lost his job for it.
Wow.
Has a wife and 2 kids, and now he's struggling to find work. And so, and it had nothing to do with work. Like he didn't mention anyone. He just said, this is my opinion.
That is a weird time we live in where you cannot, if you dare to state that the emperor is naked, your life can be ruined.
And literally. It's terrifying. And that's one of the reasons I do what I do. It's because I can say something, and I want more people to be aware of just the reality of it, because these people are acquiring power over institutions, not because they're great and qualified, but basically by creating this culture of, if anyone disagrees with us, they're a bad person.
Intimidation. Yes.
And then if you're a bad person, well, you can't hire a bad person. You only have good people work for you. And so it's terrifying. Honestly, there's not a belief in free speech in this.
No, I kind of seen Desnat as almost like the like Milo Yiannopoulos. For those that weren't familiar with him, like, he was super famous for about 5 minutes there. He became the poster child of the Republican Party in a way, because Milo was super conservative, but he was a provocateur. Like, everything he did was kind of like Desnat, And the thing that made him funny is that he was untouchable because he was a gay Jewish immigrant who was married to a black man. So there was nothing the left could say to him. There's nothing he was immune to all of it. Like, he has all the markers, all the minority markers and all the intersections of everything, but he's this crazy, outspoken, uber right-wing conservative. And so, I think a lot of people just got a kick out of it, and he was amusing for a minute there, but that's kind of how I saw Desnat, almost like, it's like, man, this is hilarious.
That's a very good analogy. It's funny, you laugh. And then again, within those funny kind of jokes, all of a sudden they go somewhere else. And now if you laughed at their jokes, if you shared their memes, you're one of them. And so and then, the mob comes for you.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest problems with the day. And you made a reference and kind couple of days ago about kind of the spiritual warfare that we're involved in. I think that's really where we are. It's not we're not involved in physical battle, so to speak, and that's where I love
flesh and blood, but
that's right.
powers and principalities. Yes.
Yeah, it's all about spiritual warfare, and that's what I loved about the whole Captain Moroni. You can take all of that and what he stood for, and you can apply it all to today, and just apply it spiritually. So,
yeah, and those who we have a lot of people among us who don't want to be on the spiritual battlefield at all, because spiritual battlefields are battlefields. They're ugly,
right?
And we need to do our best to try and keep above reproach and be don't make fools of ourselves on the battlefield, but that also doesn't mean that you cede the battlefield and give up ground where you shouldn't.
Yeah,
absolutely. So let's move on then. The next point, and I legitimately am curious about this because this is something that I've seen mentioned quite a bit frequently, and I legitimately do not know what it is. What is the Doctrine of Christ movement within the church?
Okay, so
what is
if you hear
all
some background noise, I have a toddler who sounds like he's not happy right now with mom.
We can't hear it.
We can't hear it. It's fine.
Okay, the Doctrine of Christ movement. So they're a breakoff group from the church who are, how do you describe them? They basically believe that the church is, well, I'll sum it up real frankly. Almost all of them are people that are really upset about the vaccine. And so basically because of the vaccine stuff, they're like, hey, the church is in apostasy. And they now are kind of creating this sort of narrative that the brethren are highly corrupt and they're all in with the UN and everybody else. And they're bad. And the church is a wicked organization. And so they utilize like Isaiah's words to try and make a scriptural argument that this is what's happening today. And anyway, they basically believe the church has fallen away, but they believe that it doesn't just go to our current church leaders. They go all the way back to that. It started with Brigham Young. Brigham Young, I don't know if all of them believe that he assassinated Joseph Smith through the other people, the Who Killed Joseph Smith controversy.
But they actually think Brigham Young was behind Joseph Smith's murder?
Yeah, they do.
Wow.
Or at least a lot of them do. They believe that John Taylor and Willard Richards, under orders from Brigham Young, killed Joseph Smith when the mob was there, and they were basically, I guess, using the mob as cover. It's pretty ridiculous. But
wow.
But they also believe that the Brighamites, like polygamy, they don't believe Section 132 is written by Joseph Smith. I debated one of them on that topic. And frankly, I'll tell you guys all right now, Section 132 is written by Joseph Smith. The evidence is very clear in the historical record. And so they reject polygamy. They reject. And so if you're someone who doesn't like polygamy and who's annoyed about the vaccine, they become a pretty good option for people who want to take those things and reconcile it. And so they have a real big belief about the second anointing and the gift of the Holy Ghost. They're big believers that, you didn't really receive the gift. And the thing is, there's some truth to the things that they say. And there's some interesting arguments that they make about the nature of the Holy Ghost. And that just getting baptized and receiving the gift of the Holy Ghost doesn't necessarily mean that you've received a baptism by fire, which, I think there's an argument there. But they're really big on this idea that you also will, like, the purpose of life is to basically try and get your second anointing, which is the idea that you eventually will get to see Jesus Christ in the flesh, like actually have he's in your room with you. And that's kind of your whole thing you're trying to do. You're trying to purify yourself so that he will show up in your bedroom. And yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff.
So when you say they're a break off from the church, so they're actually, I mean, do they have an organization that we're talking, or is this just a kind of a social media kind of deal?
It's kind of a loose movement. They have had people that have been more leaders than not. But that's one of the things that I kind of bring up with them is like, all right, well, who holds the keys? You know what I mean? Like, if it ain't them, like, do you guys have key holders here? And and they kind of are like, oh, well, keys don't mean that. They mean something else. And they kind of, it gets a little weird.
So from what I understood, so you said that the Doctrine of Christ movement believes that basically the church is currently in apostasy and was in apostasy after Joseph Smith. And one thing that I wondered was how that differs from the Community of Christ, which is a separate denomination that obviously believes in Joseph, believes in everything we believe up to the point of Brigham Young becoming the leader of the church, because they believe that the rightful successor to Joseph Smith was his son. Mm-hmm. And so I guess, so what is so how do they differ then from Community of Christ?
I'm not 100% sure. I don't know enough about Community of Christ's doctrines and there are other breakoff groups besides Community of Christ, our LDS Church and others. Yeah. This is not a new thing. This is just the latest iteration of a breakoff group. And they all have their own things. I don't think that some of these other groups have such an emphasis on like the second anointing, for instance, like they do. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sure that there are some doctrinal differences that are there between those groups.
Yeah. From what and like I said, I'm not really familiar with it. What I don't understand though, is that, from what my impression, the little bit that I know about it, the Community of Christ Church feels like basically like any other Protestant church denomination today, except that they accept Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, that's basically my understanding as well. And so again, when you get into the details of it, I'm sure that there are differences in their doctrines, but this group, and that's one of the things I push them on, is sort of the big differentiator between us and any other church is the idea of priesthood keys, mm-hmm. right? We have a very particular view of what priesthood keys are, and we believe that those are held by President Nelson and the Quorum of the 12. And so the first thing I ask is like, okay, do you guys even claim to have keys? And if you don't have keys, I'm not interested. Just as a Christian, I'm searching for the institution that has the keys given to Peter, right? And that's just like a basic thing for me. And so what they try and do is get around it to saying that keys aren't like authority, they're like special kinds of knowledge. And I've heard some of these arguments. Frankly, I just haven't really found them compelling. And so again, it
kind of reminds me of the Protestant view of the priesthood of all believers kind of principle.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is you eventually will go down a priesthood of all believers route if indeed keys are just special knowledge. But it seems very clear to me, if you actually go and read the New Testament, that there was a particular type of authoritative structure that was put in place by Jesus Christ, with the Quorum of the 12 Apostles being at the top of that hierarchy. And so any institution that claims to be his, that doesn't claim that is, that's why I have a lot of respect for Catholics. I have a lot of respect for Orthodox. I think those traditions, they go way, 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 way back, because they actually are rooted in that original structure, and they understand the need for that authoritative priesthood structure. And that's one of the reasons I just can't, like, there's lots of things I love about Protestants, but you don't jump over the first hurdle if you don't believe in that structure.
Yeah. Yeah, it is different. Obviously living here, I'm familiar with, and there was a time, without getting into the long story in my life, where I completely fell away and was living in the world, and just there was a whole lot of fun to be had out there in the world, and I was ready to take it by the horns and enjoy it. And I did live that way for quite a few years, but then, I actually did. I did end up there. A lot of things happened. Like I said, I won't get into a long story now, but I quote unquote got saved, and I did. And I started going to church. I started attending evangelical churches here with some of my coworkers and friends. And there were several different churches in the area that I attended for a while. They were really, really good. And there is a lot of, there are certain things, like one of the things that, when I used to listen to the Maxwell Institute podcast a lot, one of the things they would talk about was holy envy, of like, what is there about other denominations that you kind of envy? And there were things and are things that I kind of envy. Like, one of the things to me, the evangelical churches, there's such a hardcore focus on recognizing the Holy Spirit. And it's like, there's whole church services that that's all it's about. It's all about creating, you know, an environment through the preaching and music where you feel this awesome just burning in your chest, and you feel this great feeling, and they're like, this is the Holy Ghost, you know, feel it. And it's kind of cool because, you know, it's something that I feel like is like an elementary that you should be able to recognize that before you move. You know, to me, that almost feels like the milk before the meat in a way, you know, like I feel like, you know, we almost sometimes put the cart before the horse. Not that we don't recognize the importance of feeling the Holy Spirit, but sometimes I feel like there's not a lot, and maybe not enough emphasis.
Well, and I went to Baptist evangelical schools growing up. I went to a Catholic high school. Like, I've interacted with a lot of different denominations, and no, there absolutely are things that are enviable in all of them. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice if we don't get to know and interact with those faith groups and learn about the way that God works through them. There's no doubt that God works in these denominations. Do they have the fullness of the gospel? No, but you know what? Just because we have the fullness of the priesthood authority and the keys and the ordinances and those sorts of things doesn't mean that we have it all right. And there are lots of things that we can learn from the way that they do things that we could incorporate into our own faith tradition. And Brigham Young and Joseph Smith were very much about that. They even talked about the idea that, hey, you know, anybody who's got truth, come and bring it to Zion. And so I'm a big fan. People kind of might not think, they kind of think of me as an intolerant guy, but they don't really. I'm actually big on like interfaith work and talking to people across aisles and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I love it. And we definitely don't have the corner of the market on being able to call ourselves Christians. And that's something
absolutely not.
Yeah.
And I think President Nelson has done a marvelous job really leading that effort. And I think we could do that more so locally as well, reaching across the interfaith aisle there.
Oh yeah. And frankly, you can, as I have done that, I've found that it has led to missionary opportunities.
Right.
Not because I was out there, you know, secretly looking for them, but just because when people get to know each other and they, you know, all of a sudden people realize, well, hey, these Latter-day Saints are actually really nice. They're actually really thoughtful. They seem to actually know what they're talking about. They aren't a bunch of crazy lunatics. And all of a sudden the culture around you begins to change because people begin to actually get to know who we actually are. But if we just sit and hide from other denominations and people of different opinions, then, you know, we got a problem. But on the same time, at the same token, don't cede ground. You know, building a bridge doesn't mean you compromise your values. What it means is that you look for the things that they're talking about that are true, and you kind of like shake hands over those things. Say, hey, I like this that you're doing. And then a lot of times when you do that to people, they'll reach back and say, well, I like what you're doing. And you're being honest. Like, there are things that you can validate that are indeed true and right and good, even if they're missing the mark on other areas. So
absolutely. I've experienced that. Yeah. I had a friend, I have a close friend that was hardcore Southern Baptist, and he attended my youngest son's baptism. And it was interesting because he, afterward, you know, I baptized my son, and he was like, man, that's really cool. I like that you get to baptize your own son. Cause you know, in his church, the preacher is the only one that does baptizing, you know, and he was like, man, that's awesome. And I was like, yeah, I think so too, man. I'm thankful that I have that opportunity to do that. And
our priesthood of all believers is even more all of us believers.
That's right. And even like,
you can baptize, man.
Yeah. What about tithing? I know we were talking about tithing one day because there something about, you know, passing around the offering plate. And I said, well, we don't do that in our church. Well, what do you do? It's like, well, you know, tithing is private, and that's personal, you know, like there's tithing envelopes outside the bishop's office. And, you know, of course now, you know, most people pay online, but at that time it was still primarily that. And I was like, you know, you get a little slip and you fill it out and put it in an envelope, and you know, hand it to a member, either the bishop or one of his counselors, and it's private. Nobody else looks at how much money you're putting in the tray. And he was like, wow, I really like that. You know, so there are things, and, you know, we can reach common ground that way.
Absolutely.
All right. I want to ask you about another thing. I know we've been going a little while, so I want one thing, speaking of other denominations and all this building bridges and, you know, the arguments and stuff. So I've I've watched quite a few debates now, religious debates between Latter-day Saints and, other Christians. And from what I've seen, it seems like 99% of these debates I've seen, the other denomination are Calvinist.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been really interesting for me. And there's several reasons for that. Number one is that, honestly, I don't mean to be dismissive or, of Calvinism, but Calvinism, from my understanding of Calvinism feels to me like it's even further outside of quote unquote mainstream Christianity than Latter-day Saints. And because some of the stuff that they believe is really, to me, is like, wow, I didn't think any Christians believed that kind of stuff. And it's interesting because I've been seeing this a lot. And I wonder, number one, why aren't Latter-day Saints debating members of other denominations? Because it seems like it's always Calvinists. And number two, it's only been in the past few years that I've been seeing this. And honestly, I didn't know that Calvinists even existed anymore. I mean, in here where we live, to my knowledge, I have never, ever met a Calvinist in my entire life, to my knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Calvinism, I mean, I've learned about Calvinism in history classes, and I know the effect that Calvinism had on, when the nation was first founded, and it was a really big part of, the people who were here, the colonists. But I thought Calvinism was something that just kind of went away a long time ago. I didn't know it even existed. And now there's like the Apologia Church and, others that are these hardcore Calvinist movements that are really starting to seem to gain traction. And it seems to me that a lot of the traction they're gaining is by trying to debate Latter-day Saints or trying to paint Latter-day Saints in a negative light. What are your thoughts on that?
So one is that Calvinism itself is not like a particular denomination per se. Calvinism is a particular branch within the Protestant movement. It's a set of certain types of beliefs within Protestantism. The big things that separate so you may have, and it'd be very interesting for you guys being in the South, interacting with so many Protestants. I bet there's a lot more Calvinists around than you realize. They just, they'll say they're Baptist or something else, and you don't realize that they actually fall into the Calvinist camp, depending on the way that they frame their theology. So the big Calvinist beliefs that are the way, if you want to know if somebody's a Calvinist, is you ask them, do we have free will? Right? The Calvinists reject the idea of free will. They believe that everything is predetermined by God. Everything. The other thing that they do is that so predestination is probably their biggest thing that sets them apart from other groups. But they also have a lot of the same groups, or a lot of the same things. Now, one thing that Reformed theologians and Reformed theology, which is what Calvinism is, is they're really big on rational religion and on like making arguments. Now, Protestants in general are big on that. Catholics, not so much. You're not going to see as much Catholics going out there and debating. It's just not as important in their religion. But within the Protestant movement, like Protestants are out there willing to debate because they believe in utilizing the tools of reason to make a case for their belief system, which I'm kind of a fan of. Like, I think that's
awesome.
Cool.
Yeah, definitely. I'm a big fan of that.
Yeah, I have some holy envy there. But the Calvinists are like the most hardcore about that. And I think there's a reason why, because the Calvinist view of God and God's sovereignty being absolutely supreme actually gives them a consistent theology. So I have a lot of respect for Calvinism, not because of where it ends up leading you. I think it ends up leading you to conclusions that make God into a monster and make the Bible super hard to figure out because of the way that things are, it seems pretty clear we have free will, and the Adam and Eve story, or at least let's call it agency. And Adam and Eve, like that story really gets weird if you think that God predestined all of it.
Yes.
So there's a lot of problems, but if you posit that God is fully sovereign and you posit creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing,
Yeah.
I think their conclusions are inescapable. How can you say that we have free will if God is ultimately sovereign? Because that would mean that God is not sovereign over your actions. Like, you make your choices. You're not determined by anyone, but it's basically to say that your will is more powerful than God. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's a
Interesting
great
way of looking at it.
That's a great point. I like to go to my traditional, their Armenian is what it's called, the people who do believe in free will, the Baptists who hold to free, or the Protestants who hold to free will, and ask them the question, like, how can God be truly sovereign if he's not sovereign over what I do?
Mm-hmm.
How can he be all powerful if he doesn't have power to make me do what's right? And if God has the power to make me do what's right, then why doesn't he make me do what's right so that I can be saved and go to heaven?
Right.
And so and frankly, I've been looking to have that conversation with a more I guess kind of mainstream Protestant to see how they respond to it. Cause I think it's a shockingly strong argument. And I think the reason they like to go out and debate is because they actually have some pretty strong rational arguments to back their case.
Theology.
But we just reject the fundamentals and say God didn't create us ex nihilo, and we don't believe God is all powerful in the sense that he can make us do things that we don't want to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can see where those on the other side would have a problem with that, because that's something that we see a lot down here, is that the God is all powerful, omniscient, everything, everything, the very, very most you can possibly imagine of anything, all powerful, all knowing, all loving, and anything that limits that is seen really offensively. Like, you don't put limits on God.
And that's why every one of those people should be Calvinists, because Calvinists actually take it to where it goes. And if you take it to where it goes, it's horrifying, because God is a monster.
I want to point people to the debate. I really, really, really enjoyed it. You and Hayden Carroll did a debate at Apologia Church with what the two other, I can't remember the names off the top of my head.
Oscar Dunlap and Daniel Constantino. We're still like good friends with them, by the way. We still
awesome. That was
regularly.
I definitely, for those listening, I definitely strongly.
We'll put a link. We'll put a link in the description.
It was one of the best videos, and I think you and Hayden really made a very, very solid argument. I wish that we had more people being as bold and clear as you and Hayden have been in those types of debates. The closing statement you made to me was beautiful. Absolutely. I mean, I got chills, man. I felt the spirit. Really did. Because you wrapped it all up at the end, was like, okay, I know our friends over here are saying this, but my message is that God loves you and he wants you to return home to him, that Jesus Christ died for you, not just those who were predestined. And, it was like the way you said it was so eloquent. It really illustrated, shone a light on the differences between the two different theological structures.
Well, I have to say Latter-day Saints should fully embrace getting into our theology and comparing it with other theological models, because frankly, it's shockingly good. It's in my opinion, probably, besides the sort of spiritual experiences maybe that I've had within the church, the most powerful thing. Like, the reason I'm a Latter-day Saint, because I'm a Christian first and foremost, but there's a reason that I'm a Latter-day Saint, is primarily because the theology that came out of it is incredible. And then when you say, well, it all came from old Joe Smith, I'm like, really? Like, this came from that guy, and this is like answering some of the great, and the thing is, it's pretty clear that Joseph didn't even understand what he had. When you study it out, there's a level to which it's like, we all later look at this going, wow, this is crazy profound. And Joseph's like, I was just doing my thing, like, he was not a systematic theologian in any way, yet the theology that he produced is head and shoulders above the theology of other Christian denominations. And so if I'm a Christian and I want to find the Christ, I mean, of the options available, please come to me and show me something better.
Absolutely.
I haven't found it.
Absolutely. Yeah, same here. And I think some members of the church might be afraid to dig in deeply because, you know, if they see the arguments from those of the enemies of the church, and they don't understand that what I've found. So when I first came back to the church, I took in all the anti-information I could get my hands on. I watched every anti-video I could find on YouTube. I went to, the Christian bookstores and got all their anti-literature because I wanted to know. And I compared it with what I could find as far as factual information. I compared it with what the church taught. And what I found for myself ultimately was, and this is kind of the basis of my entire framework, I guess, theologically, I believe strongly that you find whatever it is that you're looking for is what you're going to find. Because I did find a lot of information that could tear down my faith. I did find a lot of information that could make me go, ooh, this is bad. I don't know about this. I found just as much information to the opposite, to say, no, this is the best thing I've ever found in my life. This is beautiful. And there's lots of conflicting information. And there's most of the information I found is he said, she said kind of things. There's second and third hand accounts. And like this person claims that Joseph said this, and this person says, no, he didn't say that. And it's like, and so those kind of things, I kind of were able to sweep those away. If there's nothing that can be solidly, absolutely, unequivocally proven, then there's no point in me looking at it, because it's just a matter of what I choose to believe. Do I choose to believe the positive or the negative? And all in all, I think what you said is really true, that the Latter-day Saint theology is such a rich, beautiful, deep theology that the more you dig into it, the more complex and beautiful it is. And the more you say there's absolutely no way a farm boy with a 6th grade education could create such a beautifully intricate and complex theological structure.
Yeah.
Like, I don't believe it.
Yep.
It is beautiful. And I don't think we should shy away from asking questions, because one of the things that I found also is that if you are willing to ask hard questions and you're willing to put in the work, and that's what I think a lot of people don't want to do. If you're willing to put in the work to really find out the truth, then from my experience, ultimately everything backs up that I'm in the right place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually have a video I'm about to release pretty soon on what I call models of understanding. And, one thing that happens is people find something like with Joseph Smith that, they can't take it's, the translation of, the Book of Mormon, certain verses in there, whatever. And then then I guess Joseph wasn't a prophet. And then it's like, well, I guess Jesus wasn't the Christ. Well, I guess God doesn't exist. And it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
Like, hold your phone here. And I've tried to tell people about this sort of understanding the anatomy of their beliefs. This is one of the videos that I did. And it's so important to understand this, because what I have found, so just using like a Book of Mormon translation issue, for instance, going back, if I believe that there's a God, if that's solid, and then I'm looking for God in the world, and I arrive at this, that Jesus is the Christ, and that the New Testament is fundamentally true. Remember, those facts exist independent of anything of Joseph Smith. That's why I say I'm fundamentally a Christian first. Like, that's where I'm operating from. I approach Joseph Smith not without any presuppositions. I approach the Joseph Smith story from the presupposition that Christianity is true. And I approach Christianity from the presupposition that God exists and that he interacts with the world, right? Now, people could say any one of those propositions are not true, but that's fine. But my thing is that you can have something with Joseph Smith that you don't understand or that is conflicting or whatever, but still believe that he's a prophet. You just might have to adjust the way that you understand some aspect of the restoration. Like, for instance, somebody might have there are different models of understanding to choose from that can possibly account for the Book of Mormon, one that people will put out there and a lot of people will reject. And I think it's a live option, though it's not one that I in fact, at one time I thought it was a good option. And then as I studied more, I learned it wasn't, was that the Book of Mormon is essentially an inspired fiction. That this is a way that you can kind of get rid of any historical criticism about the book. And you can just go to, hey, it was inspired by God, but it's not a literal story, right? Now, I, at one time in my life, thought that that was maybe the way that I'd have to go. Because if I want to hold that Joseph Smith is true, but I can't reconcile the history, maybe this is all, just inspired fiction. However, then I actually looked into the arguments for historicity, and now I came to the conclusion there's actually really good reasons to believe that this, at least to some degree, is based in history. But then you have to focus on other problems, like, well, but what about these certain translation things? And there's a lot of things you can go into, but like there's Blake Ostler's expansion theory is another way of understanding it that reconciles these two. So it's okay. What my point is just this. It's okay to say, I believe that Joseph Smith is a prophet, but I'm still trying to figure out which model of understanding about the Book of Mormon works. Or I'm still trying to figure out which model of understanding around polygamy works. And so it's okay to do that while still holding to, because you have good reasons to believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet that have nothing to do with archaeological evidence in the Americas for the Book of Mormon, right? There are other reasons to think that he was indeed, that this man was a prophet of God and was restoring Jesus Christ's church. So
even then, the archaeological evidence is becoming more and more compelling. It kind of, I chuckle when people say, "Oh, there's zero archaeological evidence of the Book of Mormon." I'm like, you haven't been paying attention the past couple decades, obviously.
Yes, and I agree. See, but my whole point is just whatever it is, if, like, for instance, if the curse of Cain and that was false doctrine, or the priesthood ban, if that was a problem for you, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Remember all the things that you do know about Joseph Smith. What are all the things that are there that say this actually is, and you can put them on a scale. And I'm not going to say that there isn't any reason, like, oh, there's no reason to doubt the Joseph Smith story. Of course there's reasons to doubt it. But if you accept the fact that Jesus Christ was who he was, that angels are real, that miracles like this are possible, and you start to examine it from that framework, it changes the dynamic. What most people don't realize when they have their kind of faith crises is that their problem isn't with Joseph Smith. It isn't with the Book of Mormon geography. Your problem is you don't even believe in Jesus. You don't even believe in God, probably. And if that's the case, well, we got to go back to the original arithmetic before we start talking about the calculus.
Right.
Because until you can add 2 + 2 = 4, we're talking about logarithms and things just isn't gonna, it ain't happening. So, and that's the problem. People don't realize it. And that's why one of the first things I ask people that kind of are like, oh, I'm having a faith crisis or whatever, or they have these issues, like, oh, well, what do you believe in? I don't want to hear about what you don't believe. We can talk. I'm sure there's all sorts of things you tell me about, but what do you believe in? Because if we want to reconstruct anything, we got to figure out where's the foundation at all. And what I've found is that most of the time when you do that, any belief they have in Christ is superficial. Any belief they have in God is weak. They've never actually really thought about these things. And so what's happening is that people are coasting along throughout their whole life, going with kind of what their parents taught and what other people around them are doing. And then all of a sudden, it isn't that this thing fell apart. It's that this is the first time in your life you've actually ever asked the deep questions. So don't panic here.
It's like the parable of the sower.
Lots of people have done this before, but you got to go through this process of understanding that goes back to the roots, to that there is a God. And then from there, finding him in the person of Jesus Christ. And only then can you move on to aspects of the restoration. Because I don't really want to talk with someone about Joseph unless they believe in Jesus, because they're just not going to get it. They're not ready for it.
I really like your the concept there, the anatomy of one's beliefs. I like that, thinking about it in such a way, breaking it down that way.
Yeah. Awesome. And like I said, even within those beliefs are different models of understanding. You don't have to remember, just because some model of yours broke, some aspect isn't the way that you thought it was. Again, go back to what you still do believe. And then you got to look at the other options that are available. Right. And yeah, you know, maybe you do lose your faith in Joseph Smith, but if you actually have a properly built faith system, you're not going to abandon Jesus Christ because of Joseph Smith. Because in my mind, that's a non sequitur.
It's Elder Uchtdorf, right? Doubt your doubts before you doubt your beliefs.
And I think that's what he's getting at. He's asking you to, hey, what do you still believe in? Start from there. Quit. If you're just sitting there, you can deconstruct anything if you just focus on all the critical things. It's kind of like, you ever watch Dateline and you watch like the first like 30 minutes of the episode and you're like, dude, the husband totally did it. The husband totally did it. Because the whole time they're just presenting the evidence of one side of the case. They're presenting the prosecution's case. Yeah. But then all of a sudden you hear the defense's case and you're like, oh my gosh. Yeah. And so again, it's one of those things that if all you do is go and listen to John DeLynne's podcast 24/7, and all you're doing is looking at the critics of the church, you'll tear this thing apart in about 2 seconds.
Right.
But then I'll tell you on the other hand, if you come and you just look at the church's stuff, you'll come away feeling great about it. But the thing is you got to take into account as much of it as you can. And I think genuinely me, when I do both and I understand both sides, that I come away that there's a better case to be made that this is legit, that God exists, that Jesus was who the New Testament claims that he was, and that if I want to find Jesus Christ, what's he up to today? Boy, I'm having a hard time finding something better than this.
Absolutely. And it does go back to that, the basic structure of belief, and which I know we're going well over an hour already. So I know there's some other things I wanted to mention, but we'll try to wrap this up. One last thing that I did want to mention before we finish, though, is the reason, the way that I first discovered Jacob here was several years ago. I, like many people, discovered Dr. Jordan Peterson, who's now a insanely famous, clinical psychologist who does these speaking tours and whatnot. And I really, really was fascinated by his approach of the intersection of psychology, philosophy, and religion. It's something, because those are the things that, for me personally, were like really that I was really, really fascinated with at the time. Obviously psychology is like, that's my passion. Religion, I'm very passionate about, obviously. And, philosophy is if you understand anything, I'm not well versed in philosophy, but if you understand the basics of philosophy, you understand that underpins everything. You have a philosophical framework you're operating on, whether you understand it or not, you do. And so the way he put all this stuff together was brilliant, and I loved it. I was like, man, and everything he said was like, it felt like stuff that I knew, but I just was never able to put into words and was never able to express the way he does. And for a long time, I was the only Latter-day Saint that I knew that even knew who Jordan Peterson was. And it felt really lonely. I was like, man, because I started seeing how the things, so much of what he says falls so perfectly in line with the restored gospel in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that it was just blew my mind. And so I was like, so what do people do now? Okay, you have the internet. If you're into something weird that nobody else is into, you take to the internet. So that's what I did. I'm into something weird that nobody else is into. So I took to the internet, and I'm like, I know there's got to be other Mormons out there that are into Jordan Peterson. And so I looked, and I eventually stumbled across a Facebook group called the Latter-day Lobsters, Latter-day Lobsters and Sordid Saints. Yeah, Jordan Peterson and the Restored Church. And I was so excited. I was like, oh, this is it. I finally found my people here. And I started digging into it and was really shocked. It was not what I expected of individuals who were supposedly faithful Latter-day Saints who followed and understood anything that Jordan Peterson said. And it really, there was really, really smart people in there. Some people that are way smarter than me in that group, but there was a lot of just garbage, man. A lot of trash talking, a lot of people just cussing and insulting each other. And just like, I'm like, what is happening here, man? It's like, there's this dumpster fire. Like, there's so much potential here. What's going on? And I watched certain people as they interacted in the group. And one of them that really stuck out to me was Jacob. And, Jacob Hansen always had, in my opinion, what seemed to be very insightful, intelligent things to say. And he would almost without exception get dogpiled completely. Just people just jumping on. Oh, you're such an idiot, man. What are you, Jacob Hansen? Here he comes again, saying some crazy nonsense. And I was like, what is going on? So,
you remember those?
I do remember.
And
I do remember.
For all of us, Jacob has pretty thick skin, and he's able to take it because he didn't shy away from it, man. There's times where you'd get dogpiled so hard, I would have probably just deleted Facebook completely. But you just kept going, and I admired that. And so, I did want to touch on that really quick as far as the relationship between Jordan Peterson and the doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I've seen Jordan Peterson speak a couple times when he's come to Jacksonville. He's only come to Jacksonville twice, and that's, if I unless I want to drive 7 or 8 hours, that's about the closest I'm going to get. And both the first time I saw him, honestly, I walked out of there and I told my wife, and she's really not into it like I am, but she loves me. So she bought tickets for us to go see Jordan Peterson. And I walked out and said, you know what? He basically taught the first missionary discussion tonight. And it blew my mind. And I was like, how does people not see, how does he not see this? And it really, so what are, I know you have a lot of thoughts on that. And I know we're running out of time here, but, what would your thoughts in a nutshell be about that the relationship of Jordan Peterson's philosophical approach to religion and the theological structure of the church?
So Jordan is reaching a lot of people because he's actually going beyond the what we talk about in the church per se. He's going down to the roots of the entire Judeo-Christian tradition. So to kind of sum that up, Jordan is talking about level 1 and level 2 of the conversation, the roots of the entire Judeo-Christian tradition. Mm-hmm. And what I think the reason he's resonating with so many people, both inside the church and out of the church, is because that's where the rot is. Yeah. See, people don't realize the problems that are going on. There's a reason that people aren't leaving our church and becoming Catholics. They're leaving our church and becoming atheists. And that should tell you something. It means that people don't actually have a solid belief in God outside of what they were taught in the church. They've kind of like I was saying, they've never gone back and done the full examination of what they actually believe. And so Jordan is almost like a guide that says, hey, let's drop all the religious language. Let's drop all the presuppositions that you have as a religious person. And let's just go back to the very beginning and see where these things lead. And what he does is he points to the great tradition in the West that's been having this conversation for thousands of years. And that's the thing. It's like, we are not the first people to seriously think about these things. Yeah. And when you go through that process with him, you end up realizing that there is this foundation there. Now, and what's really interesting from a Latter-day Saint perspective is how many uniquely LDS things he says.
Oh yeah.
And that's the part that's been the most shocking to me, because, there are people who talk about theism and all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, it's when he talks about specifically LDS things like that, the union of the divine and divinity is most fully expressed in a male-female union. He's like, I'm like, yes. What? Hold on here, dude.
You posted some cool videos that Jordan Peterson teaches elders corner.
Yeah, I have a series of Jordan Peterson teaches, or when he says things that are uniquely LDS, I'm like, yes, hold up here, guys. And if you go watch those videos, it's very clear that he's talking about the exact same thing.
Yes.
And when you have people coming from totally independent points and arriving at the same conclusion, maybe you're onto something.
Yeah, that's when you're finding truth.
Yep.
And I love the way too that he breaks down the straw man arguments of the atheists, the whole bearded man in the sky who grants wishes kind of thing. He breaks he smashes all that down, And the thing that really impresses me is he approaches it from like an agnostic perspective. He doesn't necessarily approach it from a perspective of faith per se, but he presents it in such a way that the Christian traditions and the messages in the Bible are true, even if whether they are true literally or whether they're only true metaphorically.
Yeah.
And that has blown my mind, the way that even if you don't believe that God is a real, actual living being who knows you and loves you personally, even if you think it's all just metaphorical, philosophical nonsense, it's still true. It's still just as true.
Well,
the way he presents it, that thing has blown my mind.
Somebody pointed out something, and it goes back. He's actually tapping into a very old tradition, and somebody pointed out that Jordan Peterson is a Platonist. He follows Platonic philosophy, and Platonic, the idea of specifically idealism. The idea of idealism philosophically is that the mind is more fundamental than anything else.
Yes.
And if you think about it, you go, well, what's more real? The table in front of you or your experience of the table in front of you?
Yeah.
And to some extent, we would argue that actually what's really the most real is your experience that you're having.
Yes, that's the world of forms. Yeah, the Plato.
Yeah, so there's this idea with Jordan that he approaches this from, and he says, if you want to just say that God is real in the sense that it affects the experience of the world, and that the scriptures and the truth that they teach you about the nature of your conscious experience in reality, like it can be true in that sense. And I tend to say, yeah, it is. And the spiritual and the physical are all intertwined. And then it goes into interesting concepts that we have within the Latter-day Saint tradition. And anyway, it's just one of those things that is, again, there's levels of profundity there that make you, and these aren't just like some random guy making up weird stuff. Like these are very old ideas that have been around for a really long time, because they resonate with people and because they point to deeper truth that people seek. And so I always kind of see Dr. Jordan Peterson as like the perfect starting point for a person who is, struggling at level 1 and 2.
Mic drop. For those of you who are listening and not watching, that was my mic drop. I just dropped the mic. Beautiful. So I know we've held you up for quite a while now, Jacob, and we really, really appreciate your time. Is there anything else that Jackson that you wanted to touch on, or anything, Jacob, that you wanted to say before we wrap this up?
Go ahead, Jacob.
I'm good. I think we've hit on the stuff that you've written down, and thank you guys for having me on.
Yeah, it's been great. Well, as always, we really, really appreciate your time. Appreciate you coming on here with us. And it's been a great conversation. Enjoyed it thoroughly.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for having me on.
Absolutely. And we'll see you out there in the interwebs, social medias. Hey, everybody, y'all be sure and check out Jacob Hansen and his podcast on YouTube, Thoughtful Faith. So
you want to tell, before we go, you want to share, like I said, this is primarily for a lot of our listeners in the South that might not be familiar with you or other the things we discuss. So how would people who aren't familiar with you find you on the internet, Jacob?
Easiest way is just go to YouTube and search for Thoughtful Faith. That's probably the easiest way. You'll see a blue logo with the temple on it. And then you can also go to thoughtful-faith.com. That has my website with info about me and my mission, what I'm doing and why. And so people can dig in a little deeper there.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And until next time, y'all keep on striving.